Welcome, everyone, to Founders and Friends Friday. I'm Doug Weber, Chair of the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation Board of Trustees. On behalf of the board and staff, I want to thank you for your support for the Community Foundation. That's the primary reason we're gathered here today, to express our gratitude to you. We also want to share some information and knowledge and provide a way to connect you with others who love our community. Other than the date reference, you might wonder why our gathering today is called Founders and Friends Friday. Well, that name both builds on legacy concepts and bridges our current status and future. That's really our role as an organization, to honor legacy, address the present, and plan for the future. Let me explain more. As your community foundation for Washtenaw County, or our community's dedicated endowment, we serve as a kind of savings account for the community. For almost 6 decades, people like many of you on the call and many who came before us made commitments to the Community Foundation to permanently provide funding for Washtenaw County. That's the founder's reference. And that was the name given to a donor society created in 1972 and an annual donor luncheon launched in 1986. Since that time, especially in the last 5 years, we have grown exponentially to better serve our community. Much of that growth is also because of friends, including those of you in the room who refer clients to us as an umbrella organization for local philanthropy. So, founders and friends, thank you, all of you. Let's celebrate what you have made possible. When Neel Hajra took over as CEO in 2015, the Community Foundation had $75 million in assets built over 50 years. And now, just 5 years later, as of the end of 2020, we steward over $175 million. That $100 million in growth is driven by $85 million in gifts from people like you who want to make a permanent difference in this community. I say permanent because the vast majority of those gifts were endowed funds. Endowment can be a challenging concept in comparison to immediate urgent needs, and yet endowed funds provide a dedicated funding stream that allows funding to be available despite market fluctuations and other crises like pandemics. In fact, because of the strength of our endowment, in 2020, we were able to distribute nearly $8 million in grants and scholarships, setting a new record for the Community Foundation. Of that, $2 million in grants were specifically earmarked for COVID response and relief in Washtenaw County. We remain committed to doing even more community in partnership with you. I hope you feel proud of what we are accomplishing together. Again, thank you. I'm now going to turn the program over to our CEO, Neel Hajra, to tell us more about the impact of partnership on our community. Neel?
Hey, thanks, Doug. Doug, thanks for your leadership of the foundation, as well as your family's multi-generational commitment to our community. While I'm at it, I'd like to thank trustees as well. We have an incredible board, and our growth and success has started with donors like you in the audience, as well as our trustees who are really committed to Washtenaw County and the foundation. One aspect of the growth Doug mentioned is through the increase in the number of our nonprofit endowments, our funds that support a specific nonprofit in perpetuity. These nonprofit endowments are now our largest type of asset at the foundation. They represent more than a quarter of our total assets and now support more than 120 local nonprofits through more than 160 funds. There are more funds than agencies served because both individual donors and organizations themselves can establish these permanent funds as a source of steady revenue. We have nonprofits represented at our gathering today, and we are so proud to play a role in their work year in, year out through the automatic annual grants coming from nonprofit endowments. So nonprofit endowments are one way we leverage our core strengths in service of the community. Another way is through a brand new effort that puts some of our invested assets to work locally without compromising the perpetuity of our charitable funds. we have started prudently investing 1% of our invested endowed assets locally to promote a more equitable local economy. That adds up so far to $1.7 million invested locally for both financial and social returns. What this means is that every permanent fund now extends its impact through both the grants or scholarships it produces, as well as through how some of its assets are invested locally. As we grow, we'll continue to increase the amount of investment capital we circulate locally. So through your continued support and referrals across all of our charitable funds, you are making even more local impact possible. In addition to impact investing in nonprofit endowments, our recently concluded 5-year strategic plan introduced some other notable new work as well, such as the Ann Arbor Entrepreneurs Fund, where 25 local tech entrepreneurs to date have committed to supporting the community through a permanent fund at the foundation, as well as the commissioning by the foundation of new research that identifies community challenges and opportunities where your philanthropy and our philanthropy can make a difference. Our board and staff are now planning for the future. Our current strategic planning process is exploring how increased scale and sophistication can be parlayed into doing even more for Washtenaw County in the next 5 years and beyond. As part of that planning process, in 2020, we adopted new core values that will be central to our work for years to come. These core values are prioritizing community as our central value, as well as pursuing equity, earning trust, leveraging knowledge, and enhancing collaboration. Now, these core values are on our website and also available through the virtual resource center that has been made available to you through the virtual platform that we're on today. So check it out. In the spirit of the recent past informing our future, I want to highlight another really important effort that was just a concept in 2015, but has turned into a major new local force for changing lives, thanks to many of the donors here today. Our community scholarship program launched in 2015 to serve local youth who are first-generation college students, students of color, or students from low-income families. The program provides each student with multi-year funding packages and a college success coach who serves as a dedicated mentor to help students navigate the challenges and trials and tribulations of college life, ultimately to obtain a college degree. The Community Scholarship Program now serves 62 students who have been awarded more than $1 million in scholarships. This spring, the first cohort of students, 10 of them, will be graduating with bachelor's degrees within 4 years of starting with us as scholars. Because of the dedicated college success coaches in particular, as well as an emergency needs fund that has been even more critical during the pandemic, our scholars are persisting and graduating at levels well above expected benchmarks, and we're really excited about that. We're proud that our community scholarship program has become a model for community foundations nationwide, and it really represents a true collaborative partnership with area institutions and so many of you who are donors. Thank you so much. The reason we have made the community scholarship program a priority is because all of us know that higher education leads to better jobs and incomes, which in turn elevate families and communities. It's not surprising that efforts to increase the attainment of college degrees has become a growing movement and policy discussion at local, state, and federal levels. We're really excited to learn more about the free college movement today from an expert. As Doug said, one of our goals of this event, beyond thanking you and connecting you with others, is to share knowledge, which is also one of our core values. Dr. Michelle Miller Adams is a senior researcher at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, and she is a professor of political science at Grand Valley State University. She is co-director of the Institute's place-based research initiative that explores how communities facing economic challenges can create broadly shared prosperity for their residents. Because of the connections between education and economics, Dr. Miller Adams is one of the nation's leading experts on the free college movement, and she advises policymakers and community stakeholders on their tuition-free college initiatives. We are so honored to have her here to share some of those insights with us today, particularly on the role that philanthropy plays within the free college movement. This presentation will be recorded and slides will be shared with you afterwards, so you don't have to worry about capturing notes on all the great information Dr. Miller Adams, or Michelle, is going to provide us. Please do enter your questions into the chat function, as we will have time for Q&A following her presentation. Michelle, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Neel. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm joining you from an hour and a half down the road in Kalamazoo. We're fast drivers here in Michigan, but I lived in Ann Arbor for 4 years, several decades ago, and it's a lovely community, and it's wonderful to have the Community Foundation so engaged and doing all the things that Neel and Doug have just told you about. So let's see. I'm hoping my slide advanced. I'm here today to talk with you a little bit about how philanthropy fits in to the free college movement. I've been working on understanding tuition-free college programs, place-based scholarship programs, ever since the Kalamazoo Promise was announced 15 years ago in 2005. And yeah, it's hard to boil down to all that work into 10 minutes of comments, but I'm going to do my best here. So first of all, I wanted to give you a little bit of context on what is really more rightfully called the tuition-free college movement. Most of the programs you're going to hear about do not make college free. Rather, they take away that very high barrier of the cost of tuition. And in many cases, as your community scholarship does in Ann Arbor, they make really critical investments in students to help support them through post-secondary access, progression, and completion. There are a number of motivations behind this growing movement that is taking place at the local, state, and national level. And I've recently finished writing a book that kind of disentangles these reasons, because often they're sort of just smushed together. One concern is concern about college affordability and the really rapid rise in the price of tuition. A second concern is an interest in addressing longstanding equity gaps along racial and economic lines in college access and completion. And finally, a third rationale for the free college movement is an interest on the part of communities and states in building a better trained workforce, which creates both upward mobility for workers and also economic vitality and competitiveness for communities and states. Philanthropic efforts have been central to the growth of these free college programs in a variety of ways. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail in a few minutes, but just briefly, philanthropists serve as key stakeholders in these Promise programs, which is what we call them. They often provide seed money and in a few cases, full funding for scholarships and support efforts. And philanthropists, foundations, community foundations, private foundations, and individuals sit at the table of community members who work together to align a community in support of its scholarship and its goals. As tuition-free college programs expand at the state level and possibly, spoiler alert, at the national level, philanthropic engagement will continue to be needed, even if these are publicly funded programs, especially around providing the navigation and support services that are critical to student success. So a little more definition here. I, in particular, study what we call place-based scholarship movement programs, which are sometimes also called college promise programs. And these are a subset of the broader free college movement. I define them, my colleagues define them as geographically bounded scholarship and support initiatives, often at the level of a school district, sometimes at the level of a county or a city, or sometimes even an individual high school. They usually include residency and enrollment requirements, so they function, even though the scholarships don't get awarded until students graduate, they function as early awareness programs. So if a family is considering moving to a community or enrolling their child in a certain school district, they know that 15, 18, 20 years down the road, this scholarship will be for them. And through that early messaging and focus on a large number of students in a given geographic location, these programs are seeking not just to provide opportunity to scholarship recipients, but actually transform the systems that serve those students. So bring about changes in the K through 12 school setting, bring about changes in the community around student support, and sometimes bring about changes in higher ed institutions as well. The current wave of Promise programs began in 2005 with the Kalamazoo Promise, but there are now about 200 different programs in the nation, which include both community-based programs as well as some scholarship programs that emanate from community colleges. And I've just given you a link here to a database that we developed at the Upjohn Institute, which provides these definitions and allows you to search these programs, filter them, compare them. And also, if you're interested in more detail, send a request to us to download the database. I think there's something like 90 variables for each program in this database. So feel free to browse that and take a look at it. The programs all look different, which is, of course, excuse me, very challenging from a research standpoint. But this graphic shows you one way to divide the population of Promise programs between the statewide programs that are up here at the top, which affect residents throughout the state. And I'll say a word in a minute about Michigan Reconnect. Community-based programs like the Kalamazoo Promise, or in the other direction from you, the Detroit Promise, and institution-based programs which come out of higher ed institutions themselves. So I promised to say a little bit more about what philanthropy has to do with all of this. And I offer a few examples here. In some cases, it is philanthropic organizations or individuals that are essentially paying for the whole enchilada here. Kalamazoo Promise is an example of that. The Kalamazoo Promise was established and is funded by a group of anonymous local donors. 15 years later, they're still anonymous, which I think is a pretty good trick. The El Dorado Promise in El Dorado, Arkansas, which is modeled closely on the Kalamazoo Promise and was launched shortly after, is funded by a local, the charitable operation of a local business, the Murphy Oil Corporation in El Dorado. Sometimes foundations will provide challenge grants or seed funding for a Promise program. That's been the case in both Pittsburgh and Denver. And you will often find community foundations and other local foundations either in the driver's seat or at the table. Some examples are the Legacy Scholars in Battle Creek, the Challenge Scholars, which affects a single high school in Grand Rapids, and the New Haven Promise. Community foundations play a role in all those. I should also mention the small town in Southwest Michigan of Buchanan, which started a Promise program a few years ago that is also housed and was really led by the Community Foundation. For those institution-based programs I mentioned, the community college foundations are providing the funding for those programs, and many Promise programs solicit donations from individual donors. We've seen over the past few years a growing incidence of these scholarship and support programs at the statewide level. These statewide programs are publicly rather than philanthropically funded, but philanthropy continues to play an important role, especially in the area of student support, which is a critical component of this transformational role of these programs. I wanted to just give you the example of Tennessee Achieves, which is the operational arm of the Tennessee Promise. Tennessee has extended tuition-free community and technical college to all of its residents, which is interesting because it's a red, what we would call a red state. So this is an issue that draws bipartisan support, which is interesting. Tennessee Achieves is organized as a nonprofit organization, and the support services that it provides are funded philanthropically. One piece of that is a very large-scale mentorship program, which involves about 9,000 community mentors who help recent high school graduates, or soon-to-be high school graduates, navigate their way through the Tennessee Promise application process into college. And then philanthropists are also engaged in more tailored support programs such as the Knox Promise, which is in Knoxville, that provides some of the kind of emergency funding and support funding that your community scholarship provides as well. Just last month, the statewide Promise movement extended to Michigan in the form of a program called Michigan Reconnect, which was proposed by Governor Whitmer a couple of years ago and funded by a Republican legislature, again illustrating the bipartisan draw of these programs. Michigan Reconnect provides a tuition-free community college degree to adults ages 25 and over in Michigan who do not have a college degree. There's one wrinkle. There's always a wrinkle with these programs. The wrinkle is if you live in an area that does not have a community college, if you're not in district, you will not get your entire tuition paid for. The in-district rate will be paid, but you will obviously have to be paying out-of-district rate because you don't have a community college in your area. But a very important component of Michigan Reconnect, and something that was not amply funded by the state, was this idea of navigation support for adult learners, either first-time college goers or returning college goers who need some support and advice as they navigate that path into higher ed or back into higher ed. They need to know what jobs are in demand in their area, what kind of degree or credential they need for that job, where they can obtain that degree or credential, a lot of other things about navigating the college going process that can be formidable. So among the people who are helping with this effort are advisors from the Michigan College Access Network, or MCAN, which is a philanthropically funded organization here in Michigan that's been helping communities put college-going resources together for maybe, 13, 14 years now. So before I wrap up and turn to any questions you may have, I want to say that I don't feel that Michigan is ever sufficiently recognized for this, but we really are a leader in the free college movement. We have many community-based and foundation-based college access and support initiatives, including your own community scholarship program. More than 20 communities in the state have established place-based or Promise scholarship programs. We have the Michigan College Access Network, which has done this convening and has provided some grants as well in, I think, close to 40 communities around the state. The state has funded, this is a program that originated under Governor Granholm and was expanded under Governor Snyder. The state has authorized 15 Promise zones, which are Promise communities in high poverty communities. I believe that 12 or 13 of them are up and running now. A predecessor to the Michigan Reconnect program introduced last year by the governor and billed by her as a GI Bill for essential workers that you may have heard of is something called Futures for Frontliners. This was a time-limited 1 year, really a time-limited program for people who worked in essential worker roles during the peak of the pandemic. And they had until the end of last year to apply, and if approved, could start college as early as January. And over 3,000 applicants to that program came from Washtenaw County. And then finally, as I've mentioned, Michigan Reconnect, which is this tuition-free community college program for adults over 25 without college degrees. The application process for this is underway. This is a program that is not time limited, but even in these very early days, over 1,000 applicants for Michigan Reconnect have been received by Washtenaw Community College, your local institution. The response to both of these programs was overwhelming. It was higher than what program designers had expected. There seems to be a tremendous appetite for being able to afford the cost of college and investing in one's own human capital. And so it's really encouraging to see our state be such a leader in this area. So I finally left you with two resources. One is free and the other one is not published yet. But the book on the left is something that I wrote. It's a very short book. It's an ebook that is available to be downloaded for free from this link. You can also find it on the Upjohn Institute website. It's a little out of date, but it provides a good overview of the Promise movement And then the book on the right is the one I finished recently that will be available in April. And you can learn more about it at that link. But I try to take more of a high-level look at how this movement has evolved and where it is going. So let me stop there and just ask, I guess I turn things back over to Neel and see if we have questions.
Michelle, that's such great information. Really appreciate it. And thank you for lending your time today. And we do have some questions. And I'll also encourage the audience, as Michelle and I chat a little bit, I'm going to be watching this screen in case some more questions come up during our conversation, because we do have a few minutes, Michelle, if you don't mind, just to banter a little bit.
I like to answer questions.
Awesome. So, a very brass tacks question. How many students have taken advantage of Michigan Reconnect this year?
So no one has yet taken advantage of Michigan Reconnect because the program was just launched 1 month ago. I'm trying to think if off the top of my head I have the application numbers, and I don't think I do, but I do have off the top of my head are the applications for that time-limited Futures for Frontliners program. And sure. I will give you those just so you can get a sense of the scale. In those essential worker rules, something like 625,000 workers in Michigan would have been eligible. About a fifth of those applied, so about 125,000. And I believe at last count, 85,000 of those had been approved. So even though that's just a one-year program, that's a pretty hefty number of people who intend to go back. Michigan Reconnect is just starting. There's been a lot of application action in the first few weeks of the program. But one of the very nice design features of this program is that once you're approved for Michigan Reconnect, you can start a higher ed program, and it's very flexible. If you can go to a community college, you can do a short-term certification or an associate's degree and then transfer, and you can start anytime. So we don't know yet, but we think it's going to be big.
Sure. I really appreciate that. It sounds like there's a ton of potential, and we'll see in the next few years how much that potential is realized. I'm aware behind the scenes, I know some of the foundations that were involved in sparking the endorsement of Michigan Reconnect, and it was an interesting private-public partnership to sort of get that passed and going. And so, Michelle, could you talk a little bit about, certainly the public sector and government brings scale. And it's really hard to get things done en masse without that scale. Could you talk a little bit more about, and you touched on this, what are philanthropy's key characteristics where we can make a difference either as donors or as institutions and be sort of that important catalyst in these processes?
Right. Well, I think, you don't measure your return on investment in very narrow ways, which often private sector actors will do. The science of measuring the return on human capital investments is getting much better. But the other thing about philanthropy is philanthropists can make long-term investments. So providing things like emergency grant funding or a high-touch intrusive coach, those things are upfront expenses, but their impact is going to be additional degrees for students down the road, which is going to represent value to the students and also value to everyone else. I mean, that's why the public sector supports higher education. Higher education is good for the people who get it, but it's actually good for everyone around the people who get it. It has so many benefits for communities and for residents of communities. I mean, Ann Arbor's a great example. It's a community that has a high proportion of people who are educated, and that's very good even for the people in the community who don't have the college degrees. So I think that broader look on return on investment and those critical investments around student support, emergency aid, that are the difference between a student dropping out and a student completing are really essential.
Sure. And, I smiled when you said high touch and intrusive coaches, because my parents are high touch and intrusive, and it's what helped me get through college, right? And so that really resonated with me because we're aware that the coaches we engage are intrusive, but in a way that some of our scholars may not have the same familial supports or experience they need to navigate the really strange world of campus, right? It can be a real systems shock to new scholars.
And this was a very important finding from the Detroit Promise, where the Detroit Promise sent a lot of first-generation and low-income college goers to regional community colleges where many of them struggled. And at the same time, they were doing a study of this high touch intervention called the Detroit Promise Path, which was exactly that. It was someone on your case. They got your cell phone number. They know if you missed class. They know if you didn't do badly on if you did badly on the midterm. They support you in so many ways. And the results of that intervention were so positive that a couple of years in, the Detroit Promise did away with the experiment and just provided those high touch resources to everyone. And so I really admire the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation's Community Scholarship Program for not buying into the idea that money, just money, is the solution to the problem. Money alone is not enough. And we know that from Kalamazoo, and we know that from a lot of research into the Promise program. It's really money plus support and community backing and alignment that makes these things happen.
That resonates, and I love that. And we have 5 years of evidence now of the radical positive change introducing those supports has made for the graduation rates of the scholars we're investing in. So we're seeing that before our very eyes, Michelle, year after year. So we've got a lot of questions streaming in, so I'm going to keep this moving. So I'm going to read an audience question. We know that tuition isn't the only challenge students and families face in accessing and persisting in college. Even with the launch of Michigan Reconnect, what are ways communities can continue supporting young people? What challenges will persist even with this program underway?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Michigan Reconnect is limited in that it's only people over age 25, for one thing, without college degrees. So I would say the first thing is that we need to push our legislators and our business community to really hop on board the idea of what about students without college degrees below age 25? We're at a point, like Tennessee, where for purposes of the state's economic competitiveness and racial and economic equity challenges, we need to be making some kind of post-secondary education and training more accessible. And one way to do that is by taking those tuition costs away. A really important point is that there are many other costs. So there's a lot of role for philanthropy in supporting students through scholarships for their living expenses. But what these free college programs do is they change people's trajectory because they're so simple and easy to message about. So a senior, instead of hearing, you should fill out your FAFSA and go to college, instead, as a kindergartner or an 8th grader heard, you can go to college tuition free. And that apparently makes a big, big difference.
I bet. And so another question that came from the audience is, do you have thoughts on technical vocational education versus art/humanities? And I'll mention what we heard a lot when we were researching this was the German apprenticeship, right, and technical trades model. And so it's a question we have in our minds too, is when we say college, what do we mean? And are both paths equally effective for that lifetime success we're looking for?
Right. That's another great question. I feel like a lot of times we just say college for shorthand. And what we really mean is post-secondary education and training, which takes many, many different forms, but takes a lot longer to say. I think it's critical that multiple paths be made available to students when free college programs are created. But it's very easy to do that by because we know our community college sector offers both associate's degrees that lead to bachelor's degrees that focus on arts or humanities or social sciences, as well as short-term certification, STEM training. I do think it's a mistake to do what some states have done, which is put field of study limits on statewide programs. And I kudos to the policymakers in the governor's office who designed Michigan Reconnect because they didn't do that. The problem, and I'm a professor, I spend a lot of time on campus, a big problem is students change their majors. They change their majors all the time. The major most frequent, the major that changes its major most frequently is actually the math major. And STEM majors change their majors on time. So a lot of the time. So if you limit field of study, you've added a whole layer of complexity around administrative tracking of what students are doing. But more importantly, and I say this as a professor of a social science field, the skills being taught throughout higher ed, whether community college, four-year schools, social sciences, arts, humanities, are critical thinking skills and analytical skills and communication skills that are deeply valued by employers. So whatever the path is, it's important that students have freedom and flexibility to choose in line with their interests and choose what's right for them. and post-secondary education and training pays off almost whatever its flavor.
Sure. Well said. So I wanted to go back to your experience observing the Kalamazoo Promise and connect it to a question from one of our audience members. What changes have you noticed in the Kalamazoo area from the Kalamazoo Promise, i.e. In the broader community? A follow-up is, any changes in K-12 schools and academic standards or expectations that connect to the Kalamazoo Promise?
Those are great questions, the bread and butter of what my colleagues and I do. It's very hard to measure changes in the community. My colleagues and I are just now starting to look at what happens to Kalamazoo Promise scholars once they enter the workforce. But there have been some powerful system changes in Kalamazoo as a result of the Kalamazoo Promise. One of the most simple and evident is a growth in the size, a dramatic growth in the size of the Kalamazoo public schools, which have grown by 25% since the promise was announced.
Wow.
And that's very rare. Anyone who knows what high poverty urban school districts in Michigan look like knows they're shrinking, they're not growing. Another interest, and that of course has brought money into the district and into the community. We've built some new schools. We've had to do some redistricting. There's been a lot of renovation of buildings. But another really interesting thing is that the demographics of the Kalamazoo public schools look very similar to what they looked like when the promise was announced. So we don't know what the donors were trying to do, but we kind of can infer their agenda, that they wanted to connect people more closely to the community and the schools. And they've done that. So you still have roughly the same racial and demographic breakdown in the schools, roughly the same percentage of students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunches. So it's kind of locked in the district while growing it as well. The broader community, I mean, I lived here for 7 years before the Kalamazoo Promise was launched. It's very hard to measure, but the Kalamazoo community in terms of economic dynamism and life downtown and restaurant choice. I moved here from Ann Arbor, so I suffered a little bit at first, but it's getting much better. And the Kalamazoo Promise has something to do with that. But as I said, it's very hard to measure what. The school district has seen increases in test scores. We've seen an increase we've seen not so much an increase in college going, because a lot of Kalamazoo Public Schools grads already went to college, but a shift because of the benefits of the program. Many students who would start at community college went straight to four-year institutions. Many who stayed local have left home. Some of those are coming back. So these are some of the things we're trying to track.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. With the advent of promise zones, I wanted to relay another question from the audience, which is, what is the communication strategy to reach potential recipients in promise zones? Are there ways to provide assistance to overcome historical barriers in accessing these? And Michelle, I will mention this resonates with us because we have a full-time staffer who very systematically visits every high school she can, works in concert with counselors, because we know just putting up a flyer or putting out, a web release will not get the students we're actually looking to benefit the most from our programs. And so it is true, there is a real challenge in connecting with the very scholars we're trying to uplift.
Yes, it's really hard. And it's extra hard for a program like yours where you're not funding everyone coming out of a given high school. So you can't go into that high school and say, hey, you're all eligible for free tuition, which is what a promise zone can do, or what you can do in the Kalamazoo Promise. But even with that, it's really, really hard. And it's that messaging in the promise zones where you have buy-in, not just from the schools, but from the businesses. The businesses are talking to the parents of kids in the schools. You've got to have messages coming at you from a lot of different places. But even with that, it's hard. So the Kalamazoo Promise has actually located now staff in the schools. And I'll tell you right now, in the high schools, with the pandemic and having to do everything virtually, their jobs got a lot harder, but they will harass you via email until you tell them what your plans are next year. That one by one, we will not take you off our list until you answer, are you using the promise? Where are you going? What are you doing? Et cetera. So it's a combination of sort of public messaging, robust messaging, and that retail work with parents and families and community organizations and churches to really push the message out into the community. And that's what that alignment piece that I'm always talking about really means.
Yep, that makes sense. And you're using words like harass. Again, I'm thinking about my parents and family, and I'm really glad that we're starting to recognizing that everyone deserves that kind of positive, inspirational harassment, right? We think everyone deserves that.
Yes.
And it's interesting to hear you say that that's one of the value adds of the Kalamazoo Promise system. So, Michelle, I'm going to pose one last question, then I'm going to exit stage left as you answer and hand over to my colleague, Shelley. But I actually wanted to pose a question about the relationship between higher education and philanthropy. We've talked about the public sector and philanthropy. What we have found as we've accelerated our work with scholars in more deep engagements is our goals and our methods don't always mesh with what goes on campus. And we're finding that it takes a lot of time to reconcile our scholarship model, our services, with what colleges may be prioritizing for the very same students, whether it's their support network or their method of financial assistance. And we're lucky in that we have the capacity to engage multiple schools there, but I worry about a lot of scholarship donors and scholarship providers who don't have that capacity. So could you just talk for a minute about sort of how higher education and philanthropy should be leveraging one another? Because we know that's not always the case.
Right. You're asking me the tough question as as you exit stage left. But
that's what I do.
And thank you for inviting me today too, Neel. It's been a pleasure to talk with your audience. Thanks for all the good questions. I mean, that comes back to this issue of alignment. It's essential that the resources that wrap around students to help them achieve a post-secondary degree or credential are not siloed as they so often are. So one of the things that these place-based scholarships can do is create a table to which higher ed, K through 12, community-based organizations, business, civic leadership, and philanthropy can come and work together. And I was privileged to watch that process in this little town of Buchanan, Michigan, and to see it at a larger scale in other places as well. And it's hard work. That alignment work is hard work because people come from different backgrounds with different priorities. So I would just say, create the table, invite the right people, have the conversations. I'm so glad you asked that question, because I do just want to mention that one way to push that alignment is to learn from other people who've done it. And we have run, the Promise Movement, have run an annual conference, almost annual, called PromiseNet, which is really a networking and learning opportunity. The next session of it will take place in Kalamazoo, but we may have some virtual attendance options next November. So please just check out PromiseNet on Facebook or Twitter. And if you are interested in coming and learning more about this alignment work. And thank you so much for inviting me today. Hi, Shelley.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much. We are truly grateful for the gift of your knowledge. We've said that's one of our core values, is disseminating knowledge, and your presence today. I've learned so much from you through the years. Clear back in 2009, you and I were presenting on philanthropic partnerships to the College Forum. And hearing you talk today affirms that connections and relationships for impact and outcomes are at the heart of philanthropy. My name is Shelley Strickland, and I have the privilege of working with our founders and our friends. Whether you are a founding donor or a new friend, we appreciate your support. Thank you to our individual donors, our nonprofits who are donors to their endowments, and professional advisors who refer clients to us as your community foundation. As Washtenaw County's dedicated endowment, we carry on the legacy of thousands who have been giving for nearly 60 years, and we're committed to serving you, past, present, and future. We know one reason you value the Community Foundation as your philanthropic partner is that we bring people together, people like all of you who love this community and want to learn and collaborate to improve the quality of life for everyone across Washtenaw County. In that spirit of connection, I invite you now to join an informal small group conversation. We may not be sitting around the table together, but it doesn't mean we can't be chatting together. Please click on the Zoom link in the chat or on the text box to join a small gathering, including our trustees, and I think we'll have a picture of them, and our staff. We intentionally have built in some time before the 4 o'clock end, and we'll leave the Zoom on a little longer for you to visit with one another. Again, we'll be sharing out the slides with Michelle's resources and the recording. thank you for your ongoing support of the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation, and enjoy your time visiting with one another now.